A brown overcoat. A vanished man. And questions no one dares ask. Welcome to the Whimsy Casebook. I am your host, Morgan Finch. Let's grow this mystery-loving community. Drop a comment with where you're tuning in from. Your comments bring these stories to life. I can't wait to read them. Let's dive in. The sidewalks gleamed like old pewter from the thin, almost contrite drizzle that had been falling since the previous evening. Chief Inspector Maigret watched the leisurely parade of umbrellas drifting by the trees along Boulevard Richard Lenoir from the window of his office on the second floor of the Quai d'Orfèvres. Although he wasn't smoking, the subtle aroma of his pipe permeated his coat, scarf, and the tips of his fingers on the wooden armrests of the worn green leather chair. Sergeant Lucas was quietly perusing pages of the day's reports, making occasional pencil notes, and consistently underlining dates and addresses with a neat perfection that seemed almost timid when a low rasp of paper came from the corner. Maigret let out a heavy sigh through his nostrils, not out of boredom but rather out of a strange restlessness. The type that occasionally paid him a visit when everything was okay, and that was the issue. There were no noteworthy burglaries or murders reported. Simply routine. In the 18th arrondissement, a man was discovered dead in his bathtub, although the cause of death was determined to be natural. The Montreal girl who had gone missing and returned by breakfast was apologetic but gave no explanation. Nothing. Once more, he looked out the window. The time was shortly after 10 o'clock. Wrapped in that clean grey coat that she insisted was still in fine condition, his wife Louise would have already left for the market, perhaps making a stop at the fish booth on Rue Montorgueil. Only last week, when he attempted to persuade her to purchase a newer item, they had had a fairly mild argument about it. "It's not the coat," she had murmured gently as she used a towel to wipe her hands. Maigret had laughed at that point, kissed her forehead, and said nothing more. "You just want to feel like we're not getting older." He recalled it once more as he gazed out into the damp morning. Although it was a slight comment and hardly significant, it lingered silently in the back of his mind as he watched a man emerge from the metro entrance on the other side of the street. A man in a brown overcoat was the figure in question. There was nothing particularly notable about the figure. Moderately tall. Not ancient, but not youthful either. He walked thoughtfully but unconfidently. His motions had an air of restraint, as though he were a little out of place. Not lost, but not quite, he stopped at the corner and glanced around before continuing on, passing beneath the trees whose bark was dark and dripping from the rain. Maigret inclined slightly. The man didn't glance up at the structure. But Maigret wasn't interested in that. It was the shoes, too pristine for such a morning. And the way the man paused right in front of the door, paused for a moment, and then hurried forward. Lucas raised his head. "What, Chief?" Maigret initially remained silent. He rose and made his way to the window. The Rue de Harley had now engulfed the man. "Have you seen him?" Maigret asked, keeping his gaze fixed on the road. "Who?" It was the man in a brown coat. "Just now." Lucas blinked, got up, and walked over to him. Maigret reached for his coat without saying anything, saying, "I didn't notice." "Head? I'll be gone for a short time. You don't have to come." "Should I?" "No. Hold any calls, please." He entered the hallway with the leisurely stride of someone who wasn't totally sure what he was doing but knew that he was doing it. Stepping down the stairs into the gentle morning of Paris, Maigret walked past the duty sergeant, who barely raised his head. The scent of coal smoke and wet stone filled the street, and Maigret stopped at the corner and looked about at the people. The man was nowhere to be seen. He had the option of taking a cab or entering any of the several stores or cafés. Or maybe his hesitancy had meant nothing whatsoever. But after years of solitude, rain, and human suffering, Maigret had come to realize that the most significant actions were frequently the most commonplace. Additionally, something about that man's posture. The quick stop, the head tilt, the shoes, had stuck in his chest like a tiny stone in a shoe. He turned to face the cafe on the corner, the one with the radio muttering behind the glass and the striped awning. He sat at a table overlooking the street and said to the waiter, "Un demi." No case was present. There was not a single person in the room. No grievance. Not yet. Only the drizzle and the man who had passed the Quai d'Orfèvres, wearing a brown overcoat, were perhaps about to enter. Waiting, Maigret started his pipe. The café wasn't completely packed or deserted. Near the back, two suit-clad men were sipping black coffee and spoke softly. A woman with a net shopping bag sporadically dabbed at her nose with a handkerchief as she nursed a café crème. It was raining a little harder now, forming a hazy veil against the windows. Maigret observed the street without haste, his eyes moving slowly, as though he was more interested in the rhythm of the rain than the people around him. Relighting his pipe, he sipped his beer and remained silent. He had no idea why he was waiting. There was no sign of the man with the brown overcoat. It didn't matter, though. This type of situation had occurred previously. Years of experience as a police officer had taught him to trust his instincts. There had been a problem. Maybe not illegal. Not right, though. Like someone stepping too close to a recollection, the man had gone by the structure. Maigret dropped a few cents on the saucer after finishing his drink. As he went along the Rue de Harley, the streets were slippery from the rain and the drainpipes gurgled softly. He wasn't yet walking with intention. He simply followed the guidance of his instincts. The rain covered the city like a damp blanket of wool, bringing a sense of calmness. Doors slammed more gently. Footsteps dwindled more quickly. As would be expected, the clerk at the newspaper kiosk by the Place Dauphine had not seen anything. However, Maigret discovered a lad, perhaps 14, smoking with the arrogance of someone who knew they shouldn't be smoking outside a tobacconist's shop across the street. The boy's eyes were too old for his age, and his face was keen. "How long have you been out here?" Maigret approached and stood next to the boy under the awning, casually asking him a question. The boy gave him a sidelong glance. "Why?" Maigret gave a shrug. "I was just curious whether you noticed a man walk by. Brown coat." By themselves, they appeared unsure. 10 minutes ago, perhaps. After giving it some thought, the boy nodded. "Indeed. I caught a glimpse of him. He bore the appearance of a clerk. Stopped and stood for a while at the metro steps. Thereafter proceeded in the direction of Rue de Rivoli." "Did he visit any stores?" "No, I simply looked around." "As if he changed his heart." Maigret gave a nod. "Thank you." Without saying anything, the lad pocketed the coin he gave him and threw the cigarette into the gutter. Maigret walked carefully as she headed into Rue de Rivoli. The man may have been lured to something or someone if he had gone in that direction. Perhaps he simply wished to avoid drawing attention from the police. That occasionally occurred. People who are troubled by past issues. They had never reported any affairs. Private fears that grew till they overflowed into restless nights and hesitant rainy walks. Maigret stopped at the corner. There was a modest stationer's business tucked away between a phonograph record store and a dilapidated milliner's. It appeared to have been unpainted for a decade. The door was partially open, but the display consisted of dull ledgers, ink bottles, and a few faded envelopes. As he stepped inside, a bell jingled quietly. He was greeted by the stench of damp cardboard and old paper. A slender man with a mustache and a razor-sharp part in his hair stood behind the counter. "Bonjour," murmured Maigret. The man gave a courteous but unenthusiastic response. "I'm trying to find someone," Maigret declared. An individual wearing a brown overcoat. Moderately built. He might be in his 30s. "I just passed this place on foot." Appeared unsure. The owner of the store shook his head in agreement. I can't claim to have noticed. This morning has been quiet. Rain keeps people away. Maigret gave a nod. Yes, it does. He let the quiet to linger. After glancing at the window and the inspector, the shopkeeper turned back to the counter and started aligning pencils. Many folks come in just to look around? Maigret inquired. Not too often. People typically know what they want. School materials. Forms. A handful of office clerks from the neighborhood are present. Clerks? Yes. There are a few tiny businesses nearby. Accountants, shipping representatives. Like that. Maigret lightly tapped the edge of the counter with his pipe. Do you know if someone from one of those offices has changed their routine recently? Someone who stopped or started passing by out of the blue? The man arched a somewhat amused eyebrow. You believe I stay on course? I get the impression that you see more than he admits. A slight smile tugged at the man's lips corner. Well, there is one guy. Works at Rue de Trois Bornes, a building directly behind this one. Every Friday, he comes in for ink refills. He is always punctual and reliable. However, he arrived on a Wednesday last week. Appeared somewhat rosy. I purchased 2 refills instead of 1. Was he dressed in a brown overcoat? The shopkeeper stopped to reflect. Yes, now that you bring it up. Maigret leaned forward a little. Are you familiar with his name? No. However, I have witnessed him enter the office above the Trois Bornes notaries. I believe it's the 4th story. Quiet kind. Maigret gave a nod. Merci. Like breath on glass, the drizzle had lightened again when he went back outside. It was a short stroll to Rue de Trois Bornes. Old flats and small office buildings lined this peaceful street. The majority still had the feel of small utility spaces where ledgers were stored and routines were maintained. However, some had been transformed into studios or legal rooms. The structure in question was 4 floors tall, narrow, and had a slightly peeling facade. A 3rd-floor notary and L were stated on the plaque next to the entrance. B, on the 4th, Import, Export and Company. The air smelled strongly of damp wool and floor polish, and the stairway creaked inside. Maigret listened to the building as he climbed gently while resting his hand on the wooden balustrade. Somewhere above, a door closed. Behind one wall, a phone rang, and someone picked it up right away. He located the office at the landing on the 4th floor. Gold letters on frosted glass, L, B, and Company. As he pushed the door, an antique, mechanical bell jangled. A woman at a tiny desk raised her head. Her hair was pinned tight, and her lipstick was a shade too crimson for her otherwise pale face. She was in her early 40s. Yes? She inquired. Maigret, Chief Inspector, Brigade Criminelle. He identified himself, although his voice was soft. I'm not formally here. Merely keeping up with a thread. She squinted her eyes. A crime? No. Not quite yet. Maybe nothing. I'm attempting to locate a dude. Moderately tall. Brown coat. In his 50s, maybe. Is he employed here? She paused. Monsieur Renaudin is there. He is employed in filing. He has been here for about a year. Was he present today? She gave a headshake. No, made a sick call. He has never missed a day before. Maigret gave a slow nod. Are you aware of his residence? She paused once more. I believe it's in the 11th. Perhaps a boarding house. The address, however, ought to be in his employment file. He waited while she searched through documents in a cupboard. She gave him a little card when she got back. Name, Leon Renaudin, address, 3rd floor, right, 14 bis, Rue Popincourt. Maigret accepted it, slipped it into his coat, and smiled slightly. Merci. You've been useful. Once more, the rain had ceased outside. Like the last of a long sigh, only a faint wetness hung in the air. For a minute, he stood on the steps and gazed across the street. Just barely, something was taking shape in this. A man rearranged his daily routine. Who considered but chose not to enter police headquarters? Who was the first to call in sick? Despite the lack of certainty, Maigret lit his pipe and inhaled the smoke. There was still silence in the street below. Rue Popincourt would be his destination. Not yet, though. There was still time. There was always time. When Maigret arrived at Rue Popincourt, it was almost midday. The rain, which gathered in coat collars and gave everything a subtle scent of damp stone, had slackened into a steady drip from the eaves. He took his time. Haste was not necessary for this type of visit. The address was 14 Bisvas, a little structure sandwiched between a tiny grocery store that had worn apples in a wooden crate outside and a bakery that was closed. Where the ancient etchings had worn away, someone had penciled names on the faded nameplate next to the bell panel. Renaudin was on the third right. The stairwell was dark inside, with a subtly medicinal scent and the smell of boiled cabbage. The type of place where wallpaper peeled covertly in the corners and the heating never fully functioned. Without attempting to lighten his tread, Maigret's weight caused each step to creak. Giving folks a chance to know you were coming and being heard had an honest quality. He stopped in front of the right-hand door on the third floor. There was no internal sound. He used the flat of his hand to knock once and again. Nothing. He listened and waited. While someone was coughing above and a neighbor's radio was humming softly behind a wall, there was nothing but silence behind this door. He knocked harder, a third time. At last, there was a slight rustle inside. The sound of fabric rubbing against wood and the change in weight were not footsteps. Maigret remained silent. He just waited. Halfway through, the door opened. There was a man wearing a shirt with the collar undone and slippers. He combed his thin hair back carefully. 50, maybe 45. He had a clean-shaven, pale face and dark, round eyes that suggested he was sleep-deprived. The man with the brown overcoat was definitely him. Yes? Silently, he said. Maigret said in a neutral tone. Monsieur Léon Renaudin, are you? After hesitating, the man nodded. Indeed. From the police headquarters, I'm Chief Inspector Maigret. He did not present a badge. He merely uttered these words. Renaudin's response was not one of fear. He appeared, if anything, resigned. Could I please enter for a moment? Maigret inquired. One more pause. Then Renaudin moved aside and opened the door without a word. It was a tiny apartment. A kitchenette, a table with one chair, and a sitting space with a couch that folds out. Impersonal, but clean, no pictures, no clutter. The same brown overcoat Maigret had seen from his office window was hanging neatly on the hook at the door. He sat down without being invited, and Renaudin stood awkwardly for a moment before taking a seat across from him. Filling his pipe, Maigret remarked, "You were close to the Quai d'Orfèvres this morning." The man answered, "Yes," without contesting it. "I didn't enter." "Why not?" "I had second thoughts." While seeing the man through the spiral of smoke, Maigret lighted his pipe. "What initially prompted you to come?" Renaudin's gaze shifted to his hands. Perhaps from smoking cigarettes, his lengthy fingers were a little yellow at the tips. "I considered filing a report. However, it didn't seem significant enough." "But it's important to you." The man gave a nod. Slowly. "Indeed." Maigret waited. Remained silent. There was a long pause. Renaudin's gaze shifted to the window, through which the light of the day came through the thin curtains. Eventually, he continued, I guess you'll want to know everything. I'd rather comprehend. The man smiled slightly but without amusement. It's worse than that. There was another pause, but this one appeared to make their relationship more intense. Maigret scanned the room once more. Something about it was tentative. Not a man's room, who was going to stay? Not a book. No additional coat. A pair of shoes neatly tucked beneath the table and a single cup drying on the sink. Do you live by yourself? Maigret inquired. Indeed. No family? Not in Paris. My parents have passed away. My sister is in Toulouse, though. Friends? Not really. Maigret gave a nod, seemingly in agreement. You are employed at L.B. and Company. Yes, I do. Filing. Clerical work. I've spent a year there. You didn't enter today. Renaudin glanced down once again. I was unable to. Were you sick? I was unable to. Maigret's tone was one of gentle perseverance rather than annoyance. This is the first time you've skipped a day of work. No. Something took place? I guess so. He gave his temples a rub. I've been experiencing problems falling asleep. I got dressed and went to the metro, but I couldn't go to work. Instead, I decided to stroll. To the headquarters of the police. Yes. To tell us what? Renaudin parted his lips, then shut them again. He got up, moved over to the small window, cracked it open, and stood, standing in the draft. The quiet honk of a delivery vehicle, someone yelling at a dog, and the sound of upcars passing were all muffled by the street noise below. Maigret remained silent as she watched him. Renaudin turned at last. A woman is present. Actually, there was. I'm not sure if she's still living. Maigret remained motionless. Go ahead. She was with me yesterday. Close to our building on the corner. Des Trois Bornes Rue. Outside, she was waiting. I'm not sure for whom. She didn't enter. However, she was employed by the same company in the past. Prior to my arrival. She was only known to me by her reputation. Arlette was her name. Maigret gave a slow nod. And did she cause you any trouble? She appeared terrified. I spent a few minutes observing her. She continued to glance over her shoulder and check the time. Then she departed. That's all. However, I couldn't stop thinking about her face. There was a problem. You get it? I get it. It seemed that she had vanished. It was 2 years ago. One of the secretaries informed me of this. Disappeared without a reply. But she returned yesterday. Only for a second. And you decided to report it this morning. Yes. I thought, though, that perhaps I had dreamt it. Perhaps it wasn't her. Or perhaps I had nothing to do with it. Maigret took a moment to examine him. Have you talked to her? No. Did she notice you? I don't believe so. When you saw her, how did you feel? Renaudin turned back to the window that was open. Guilt, he muttered. Maigret's head cocked. Why feel guilty? I'm not sure. He meant it. That much was obvious. However, it was also evident that he was withholding some information. Maybe not dishonestly. Fearful. Or embarrassment. Or a murkier combination of the two. Maigret got up. I want to inquire about this woman. Arlette. Are you familiar with her last name? Renaudin gave a headshake. No. Only Arlette. And who could recall her? Madame Vernou, perhaps. She is in charge of the books. She has spent a lot of time there. Maigret gave a nod. All right. He made his way to the door. Renaudin did not immediately open it, but he did follow. You don't believe I'm crazy? The man inquired. Maigret reached for his coat and whispered, No. I believe what you witnessed irritated an old wound. The door gently closed behind him as he entered the hallway. The sky was clearing as they returned to the street. Rain was still shining on the walkways, but a sliver of sunlight touched the rooftops. Maigret never came back to work. Not quite yet. He lighted his pipe instead, then retraced his steps in the direction of Rue de Trois Bornes. Arlette's name had stuck in his head like a seed sandwiched between book pages. Madame Vernou would be the one to hear him. And then maybe the woman who had before disappeared. If she was still alive. The offices of L.B. Since his previous visit, Maigret had changed his perception of and company, located on the 4th floor of Rue de Trois Bornes. On the surface, it appeared to be a completely normal space, filled with filing cabinets, scuffed workstations, and the shabby vitality of small, silent commerce. Now, as he ascended the creaky stairwell with a strange awareness, the air seemed to hold the echoes of a past not quite gone, and the name Arlette swelled silently in the back of his mind. The previous secretary gave him a small nod, as though she had somewhat anticipated his return. Madame Vernou, are you in? Yes, said Chief Inspector. I'll demonstrate. She guided him down a small hallway past a door that was partially open and a man coughing dryly over a pile of bills. A tiny, square office was located at the end of the hallway, behind a frosted glass door that had the word accounts written in gold lettering. Behind a desk piled high with ledgers, receipts, and a green-shaded lamp sat Madame Vernou. A thick coil of grey hair was pinned at the back of her head, and she was a robust woman in her 60s. She wore a practical dress with a fully buttoned cardigan. She nodded courteously, one hand lingering on the corner of a balance sheet, but she did not get up as Maigret walked in. Thank you for your time, Madame Vernou, Maigret murmured softly. You're probably not here to look over the company's books. No, not exactly. He unbuttoned his coat and sat down across from her. Behind her desk, there was a little window that overlooked a drab wall. The office felt impervious to the city, the weather, and even time. It had no rhythm other than the ticking of a tiny desk clock. I've found a woman. Maybe she used to work here. Arlette. I'm afraid I have no last name. Madame Vernou's gaze raised. Although she didn't appear surprised, there was a brief, hardly noticeable moment when her countenance hardened. After a pause, she replied, Yes. Arlette. That was a while back. She didn't stay long. She only stayed for about 6 months. Do you recall her? Some folks are more memorable than others. What kind of lady was she? Madame Vernou folded her hands and put her pen neatly on the desk. Nice. Perhaps she was overdressed for this place. After leaving the elevator, her aroma continued to linger. The males saw her. They did, of course. Maigret gave a slow nod. Did she have a specific department where she worked? She was brought on as a typist. Was employed by Monsieur Bertrand. He is now retired and died shortly thereafter. Arlette's fingers moved quickly, but her spelling was sloppy. Because of her charm, men were willing to overlook it. What about the women? The elder woman's face flashed a fleeting smile. Less enchanted. Did she voluntarily leave the company? One more pause. She left without warning. Failed to return on a Monday morning. There was no official confirmation, but there were rumors circulating. According to Monsieur Bertrand, she had familial issues. However, she paused, examining Maigret as though contemplating whether to go on. However, a week or so before she vanished, there was an incident. On the surface, something little. She dropped a letter that was supposed to be mailed. Later, I discovered it behind the cabinet. It had no postage and was addressed to a solicitor. I thought it might be essential, so I opened it. What was it saying? The chair creaked under Madame Vernou as she leaned back. It was a request for details regarding a man's financial circumstances. No names were given. Only initials. She wanted to know if someone was going to inherit anything. I thought that was strange. Did you go up to her? I inquired as to whether she had overlooked posting something. She became pale, denied everything, and failed to appear the following morning. Maigret remained quiet for a while, allowing the image to develop. You mentioned that there were rumors. Which kind? That she had had a relationship with someone here. That maybe things had gone wrong. You are familiar with office jargon. Over coffee, people say things that they forget the next day. You didn't forget, though. Most things I forget, Inspector. People that disappear like ghosts are not forgotten by me. He gave her a silent look. Although her hands were peacefully resting on her lap, he noticed the unconsciously made motion of her thumb stroking her wedding bandon. Have you seen her since? Not till yesterday, actually. Maigret's eyebrow went up. Around 5 o'clock in the evening, I was at the corner market. The light was going out. She was across the street when I looked up. At first, I wasn't sure. She appeared thinner and older. However, it was her. I have no doubt about it. Did she notice you? I'm not sure. She swiftly turned away and continued walking. By yourself? Yes. You didn't tell anyone about it? No. Sharing it over ledgers didn't seem appropriate. Maigret gently stood up. Are you positive that was her? After 2 years, one can be as certain as possible. He nodded slightly. Madame, merci. She stopped him at the door. Do you think she has experienced something? I'm not sure yet. However, I believe she might have made an attempt to return to the world. He left her in the tiny room with her ledgers and ticking clock and went out into the hallway. The air outdoors had changed. The sky was still dismal, but the pavements had begun to dry off in places, and the drizzle had stopped. With his coat billowing slightly with each step, Maigret initially wandered aimlessly with his hands in his pockets. Arlette. A woman who had vanished into thin air. A lady who had gone back or considered going back was now invisible once more. He followed the beat of the city as he strolled in the direction of the Seine. A barge sailed gently beneath the Pont Marie, leaving a wake like a languid brushstroke, the river swelling and slow. He purchased another packet of tobacco at a small tabac by Rue St. Paul and waited at the counter to fill his pipe. A decrepit man with a wart on his cheek, the vendor remained silent. The crackle of a radio whispering something about a government vote was the only sound. Maigret lighted his pipe, the flame flickering momentarily, and reviewed the details in his thoughts before heading back out into the street. The quiet clerk with weary eyes, Renaudin, had spotted Arlette and experienced an inexplicable sense of remorse. The astute and perceptive Madame Vernou had also seen her and recalled what had nearly happened rather than what had actually occurred. And Arlette herself, maybe scared, maybe uncertain, had passed by the building, looked back at her former life, and continued to walk. However, whither to? Threads were still to be followed. The letter that was absent. If it could be located, the name of the solicitor. If he existed, that would be the man with the inheritance. Maigret reminded herself to call the records office at L.B. and Company. Personnel files might have been preserved. Even an ancient typewritten carbon copy might have had the solicitor's name. His steps were heavier now, not out of haste but with the silent weight of something forming, as he crossed the river once more and headed for the prefecture. There was more to this than a man with a brown overcoat. This had to do with a person who had vanished twice. Maigret was aware that it was uncommon for someone to make someone disappear twice. LS Records Office. B. At the far end of the hallway, down a flight of scuffed linoleum steps that masked the sound of approaching feet, was & Company, nestled behind a pair of sliding wooden doors. It smelled of old paper and glue, moist and dusty. A slight ozone from an electric heater straining in the corner touched the cool, quiet air. Before he spoke, Maigret stood at the doorway and let his presence to get ingrained in the space. Looking up from behind a desk laden with personnel papers was a young man, no more than 25, bespectacled, and slender as a rail. His shirt cuffs were a little ragged, and his face looked pale in the light of a small desk lamp. The detective nodded and introduced himself as Chief Inspector Maigret. "Please show me your employment history." "From almost 2 years prior." The clerk nodded too hastily and blinked. "Yes, without a doubt." "What sort of documents?" "A female. Worked here for a little period of time." "Typewriter." "Arlette is her first name. There isn't a surname accessible." As if his fingers could control his memories, the clerk scowled and began looking through the closest filing cabinet. "Are you aware of the department?" She was Bertrand's employee. "Typing." "Since then, he has died." "Yes, Bertrand. That falls under the clerical category." "Just a second." He turned, squealed a drawer open, and started paging through folders at a practiced pace. As Maigret moved deeper into the room, his coat brushed the dusty drapes separating the loading area from the records. The clerk hesitated. "This is it. I believe this to be her." On the desk, he placed a tiny folder. Arlette Martin was listed as the name on the tab. Maigret carefully opened it. A typical job form with the following information was included: name, birthdate, 1921, birthplace, Le Havre, date of hire, August 4, 1949, and date of termination, February 12, 1950. There was simply a weak, aged pencil note that read, "Did not return to work," in lieu of a formal letter of resignation. There is no forwarding address. He turned over the others. A couple of pay stubs. Her ID card in photocopy form. A 2-day leave request at the beginning of January. Then a faded carbon copy of a letter was tucked into the bottom. Typewritten, but only half readable, with edges that were blurry as if they had been folded a lot. The message was straightforward. "Messrs, I'm writing to ask for information regarding a certain person's estate. I've been informed that one of your clients, who I only know as M.D., might have received a recent inheritance. For reasons I would rather not put in paper, I am attempting to ascertain the scope of this financial agreement. Please respond poste restante to the branch on Rue Oberkampf if you are able to verify whether such an inheritance exists or has been processed. Maigret, yours." Read the letter twice. It was cautious and courteous. Furthermore, it said very little. No specifics. Not a single signature. However, the tone conveyed a sense of desperation that was skillfully concealed as civility. "M.D.," Maigret whispered out loud. The clerk's head cocked. "Sir?" "Nothin'. Thank you. Could I have this?" The clerk seemed hesitant. "If you agree to it." Maigret slipped the carbon copy into his coat pocket after scrawling his name in the register. He didn't move quickly once he was back on the street. Now there seemed to be a sluggish twisting. It's softening like the ground after a frost, not breaking open like a case. Although Rue Oberkampf wasn't far away, Maigret first paused to refill his pipe at a bench in a tiny square. Overhead, the clouds were getting thinner. Patches of blue were visible, and a bird near his feet pecked absently at a cigarette butt. He thought about the initials. M.D. As of yet, they had no meaning. But they meant enough to Arlette to take the chance of being found out. Enough to quit her job and disappear. Taking out his notebook, he compiled a brief list of solicitors' offices in the vicinity of Rue Oberkampf. There were 3 that were easily accessible on foot. For lunch, the first was closed. There was no record of a letter like the one Maigret described at the second, a little operation run by an elderly guy with a deaf aide. With 2 clerks working behind a wooden counter and a glass partition providing a glimpse into the senior partner's office, the third Duval et Associés, located on Rue Saint-Maur, was a modest and quiet establishment. As Maigret entered, a faint bell sounded. A girl raised her head. "Yes, sir. I was following up on a letter that may have been sent 2 years ago, asking about an estate," Maigret said, introducing himself and providing as little information as possible. Her eyes narrowed. "We get a lot of letters like that here. Only the initials were used to sign this one. M." Then she mentioned a man she called M.D. "Perhaps one of your clients." Thinking, she tapped her lip. The focus then shifted to the oldest of the 2 clerks, a man with weary blue eyes and a short mustache. The man left in whispers, entered the inner office, and came back a few minutes later. "You're lucky," he informed Maigret. "Monsieur Duval has a memory. Now he'll see you." The workplace was silent inside and smelled strongly of furniture wax and old books. As Maigret stepped inside, Duval saw a man in his late 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and white hair pulled back. "Inspector," he said with trembling hands. "I understand that you want to know about a letter that was written a few years ago." "That's correct. From a female who might be going by the name A.M., inquiring about a man with the initials M's estate. D." Duval motioned him to take a seat before stepping behind his desk. "Yes, I remember such a letter. Not the precise topic, but the way it was done. Strange. Almost anonymous. I think we responded. You recall who M.D. was?" "Yes. Delrue, Marcel. An old customer. Passed away in late 1949. Didn't leave any close relatives. However, there was some misunderstanding regarding a second will, which might have named a non-family member. It was never verified. With the assets moving to a cousin in Dijon, we closed the matter." "Did Delrue have any acquaintance with Arlette Martin?" Duval paused. "As far as I know. Marcel, however, was tactful. He had his own way of doing things, lived alone, and was modest. I believe there was one mention of a dancer." "A dancer?" "Something along those lines. It's only a profession, not a name. The kind of stuff a man doesn't talk about. Particularly a certain age of men." "Could the intended recipient have been this dancer?" "It is feasible. However, we were powerless without a legal document. Although it was mentioned, the second will was never delivered. Furthermore, the issue was resolved by the time investigations were conducted." "Was there a reaction to the letter that I sent?" M. Duval turned several pages of a ledger that he had opened. "Indeed. To the Poste Restante address, we responded. An official letter verifying that a man with the initials M.D. had died and that a settlement had been reached for the estate. Nothing more was heard." Maigret reclined a little. "It must have reached her. She did not, however, come forward. Maybe she was expecting more." Maigret gently stood up. "I'm grateful. You've been really beneficial." The day had stretched its limbs once again outside. The wind had subsided, but the sky remained pallid. The normal murmur of the city has resumed. He took a table inside, away from the window, and continued walking till he came to a peaceful café hidden behind a newsstand. He sat with the letter in front of him, the initials glaring up from the page, and ordered a coffee. M. Marcel Delrue, D. A dancer. An unnoticed advantage. Arlette was a woman who wrote before disappearing. And perhaps had come back. The inheritance had vanished. The letter received a response. But there was still a problem. Something more profound than cash. Renaudin had a guilty expression on his face. And maybe terror in Arlette's flight. Maigret gazed at his cup's rising steam. It wasn't for the inheritance that Arlette would have returned. She had returned for another reason. Something she had forgotten. The light outside had started to dim by the time Maigret got up from the café table. Even if the sun hasn't completely disappeared, the streets of the 11th had taken on the dim tint of early twilight as the lighting started to flicker on one by one. He went outdoors, paused, pipe clasped between his teeth, hands in his heavy coat pockets, and let the guidance come to him. He wasn't trying to catch a criminal. He was into a narrative that had begun long before he got there. Instead of learning something new, it was more like going back to something that had been somewhat forgotten. He strolled carefully in the direction of Passage de la Main d'Or, a little, peaceful street behind Rue de Charonne that was dotted with quiet, old buildings and shuttered factories. Earlier, he had discovered through one of Lucas's discreet questions that Arlette Martin had previously resided in this boarding house, a small home for unmarried women owned by a widow named Madame Cresson. Neither the address nor the residence characteristics had changed. The dry cleaners and locksmiths' shops were on either side of number 14, which was located at the curve of the passageway. A bell stood next to a wooden door that had been discolored by years of rain, but there was no sign. Maigret waited while pressing it. A tiny woman in her 60s with rich red hair and piercing eyes behind square spectacles was revealed when the door creaked open a few moments later. With a look of weary skepticism, she held the door half open while wearing a tattered cardigan over a housecoat. Yes? Maigret removed his hat. Police Justice Chief Inspector Maigret. Someone who might have stayed here a few years ago is the subject of my investigation. Martin Arlette. The woman's eyes narrowed. It's been a while since she was here. So, do you recall her? Everyone who has ever paid rent under this roof is remembered. Particularly those who walk away silently. With a nod, Maigret opened the door and stepped inside. Photographs of unidentified relatives lined the wall of the dull, floor-wax-smelling hall. She ushered him into a tiny parlor with a sagging sofa and flowered wallpaper. She may have been here for 6 months. Kept to herself, paid on time. Occasionally arrived late. She was never troublesome, but she also didn't leave any trace. Did she mention her place of origin? I believe that was Le Havre. She didn't mention it, though. No guests. Not a family. What caused her to depart? Madame Cresson sat down hard in an armchair and shrugged. She failed to return home one evening. She never mentioned a boyfriend, but it wasn't uncommon for the girls to spend the night with one. However, she didn't come back the following day. Or the following week. After holding her room for a month, I let someone else use it. She was never heard from again. Was there anything she left behind? A pair of shoes. An alarm clock that doesn't work. A scarf with a gardenia scent. Did she never write? Not once. As the silence dragged on, Maigret lighted his pipe carefully. Madame Cresson didn't try to fill it or fidget. Do you know if anyone came to look for her? He inquired. A few days after she disappeared, a man once stopped by. Middle-aged. Hair thinning, short coat. Claimed to be a friend. Wanted to know if she was still present. Did he provide a name? No. Were you able to believe him? She gave a headshake. He wasn't a companion. He felt uneasy. He looked everywhere but at me. Was there anything else he said? Had she left anything? He questioned. He fled when I told him no. Hurry. Didn't even bid farewell. Maigret gave a nod. Would you recognize him if you saw him again? Faces are something I remember. He thought as he pulled on his pipe. It's possible that Arlette returned yesterday. Would she have come here, in your opinion? Madame Cressen's lips clenched. She didn't ring my bell. If she did, I would have been aware. I'm always available. Was there anyone else she might have known on the street? I doubt it. Nobody from her era remains. The majority of the females went on. Or wed. This location is merely a door, not a house. He got up. Madame, merci. Is something wrong? She said as she watched him walk to the door. Has she experienced any changes? We don't know yet. Dusk was creeping along the small hallway outside. The wet cobblestones were illuminated by yellow light from the street lamps that had been turned on. As though repeating her steps from years ago rather than yesterday, Maigret went slowly. A young lady who vanished without any fuss. No police report. Not a scandal. There was only quiet. And she was back now. Just a little. Two people who remembered her and still had a tiny fragment of her in their memories gave me a glimpse. But why had she come back? Why now, too? He returned to the office at the metro. The passageways were silent when he reached Quai d'Orfèvres. Lucas tilted his head slightly as he looked up from his desk. Anything? He inquired. Maigret removed his coat and remarked, she lived in Passage de la Main d'Or, disappeared without a trace one night. After that, a man came looking for her. Anxious. Omitted his name. It might be Delrue. Perhaps. Or another individual associated with that inheritance. Lucas paused. Do you believe she returned to get the money? No. Maigret leaned back in his chair and sat. I believe she returned because there was still work to be done. Lucas, who was by this point used to the cadence of Maigret's intuition, nodded slightly. Now what? We will learn more about that. The second one. The one that was spoken of but never materialized. Someone was aware of it. Perhaps even destroyed it. I'll get in touch with the notary once again. And see whether there have been any fatalities in the past few days. Unnamed females. It might be in the Seine. Not yet reported, perhaps. Lucas left the room after taking a note. Maigret sat silently for a long time. The orange glow from the window was the only light left in the dimly lighted office. He did not move to relight the pipe in his hand, which had gone out. He recalled the malfunctioning alarm clock in the room of the boarding home. The scarf with the gardenia scent. A letter, submitted without hope, to a lawyer. Once, she had been reaching for something. Perhaps an inheritance. More than that recognition, though. A location. A name associated with something other than tardiness and perfume. He rose and made his way to the window. It was raining again. Slow and light. Arlette may still be out on the streets of Paris. Or someone had ensured that she would never be discovered again. Paris bore a delicate coating of mist the following morning. Just enough to blur building outlines and drown out the sound of tires on damp streets, not quite rain, nor nearly fog. While drinking his coffee, Maigret observed the trees bending slightly in the wind outside his apartment window on Boulevard Richard Lenoir. He had a restless night. He seldom ever did when there was no crime, no body, just echoes, and a case wasn't yet a case. Nevertheless, those were frequently the ones that remained with him for the longest. Louise looked at him from the small breakfast table where she was already dressed and folding napkins. "You're not eating," she said. With a slight smile, he went back to the table. "Yes, I will. Soon. You're considering the girl." He gave a nod. She sat across from him and put down the cotton napkins. "You don't believe she returned merely to recall?" He sipped his coffee and said, "I don't think she came back for memories, no. I believe she returned for an incomplete task. Or for a person. Louise grabbed the bowl of butter. That's the same thing sometimes. Maigret gave her a quick look. He was struck, not with astonishment but with confirmation, by something in the quiet assurance of her voice. Over the years of their marriage, he had come to understand that while her intuition differed from his, it was nonetheless dependable. He went back to the office for a little while after breakfast. The information Maigret had requested the night before had already been compiled by Lucas. There were no unnamed ladies reported. He handed over a dossier and stated, "No, Jane does in the Seine. However, I had another conversation with Duval's office. They verified what we already knew. Henri Delrue, a cousin in Dijon, received Marcel Delrue's estate. Manages a bookstore and lives alone." Maigret gave a nod. "I believe I'll visit him." Lucas's eyebrow went up. "Do you believe he is involved?" "I believe he has the remaining details." He rode the train south in the early afternoon. Beyond the windowless fields, skeleton trees, and low stone walls obscured by mist, the countryside stretched out in long grey lines. Maigret didn't read anything. He periodically smoked while he observed the passing scenery, thinking on Arlette rather than the cousin. The girl who used to live in Passage de la Main d'Or, who had cautiously written letters to solicitors and left them behind cupboards, not the woman she had become. The station at Dijon was small. Here, the air was harsher and colder. Maigret rode in a taxi to the bookshop, a small shop on Rue Chabot-Charny, sandwiched between a haberdasher and a butcher. Librairie Delrue, Livres Anciens et Modernes was displayed on a modest bronze sign. Inside, the shop had the calm ambience of a place where nothing urgent had ever happened, and it smelled of paper and binding glue. Behind the counter, a man in his late 50s was going through a box of yellowed paperbacks. He had a worn-out, expressionless face, wire-rimmed glasses, and a grey cardigan. "Delrue, Henri?" Maigret inquired. "Yes." Maigret, Chief Inspector. "From Paris's Police Judiciaire." The man's eyes sparked with surprise rather than fear. "Why are the police at my small store?" "A query. Regarding your cousin." "Marcel." Henri straightened a little, as though a forgotten name had touched him. "Marcel has been absent for almost 5 years." "I understand. Can I take a seat?" Henri pointed to one of the wooden chairs by the front window. He joined Maigret, folding his hands in his lap, after gently making his way around the counter. "We're investigating a woman who might have had a connection to him." "Martin Arlette." The man gave a slight shake of his head and blinked. "I'm not familiar with the name." "She might have had something to do with your cousin." "Or thought she was." "She inquired about Marcel's estate with a Parisian lawyer." "Implied the existence of a second will." Henri laughed breathily and dryly. "Once more, that rumor. Did you hear it?" "Obviously. Perhaps the notary said that Marcel had already mentioned another beneficiary after his death. However, no will was discovered." "Do you believe that one existed?" Henry's mouth pushed shut. Marcel was complex. Despite leading a simple life, he kept secrets. Predominantly women. He didn't take them home with him. With the family, he was always quite polite. Occasionally, however, a name would come up in conversation. One of them might have been Arlette. "Did everything come to you?" "Yes." No one else was present. He had no siblings or children. It was a modest estate. Only a few savings and the apartment. "Did anyone get upset over that?" "I never got a response. After the discussion about another will, I kind of expected it, but it never materialized." Leaning back, Maigret said. "Arlette, have you ever seen this woman?" Henri looked at him. "How does she appear?" "Thin. Now in the early 30s. Dark hair. Walks like someone who has been watched too much and wears too much makeup." There was a silence. Henri rubbed his nose bridge. A woman entered the store a few months ago. Purchased an antique Paris book. Paid in coins. She maintained a low gaze. She omitted her name. But she appeared to be haunted. That might have been her. Maybe. I didn't give it much thought. Such women are not uncommon. Maigret gave a nod. Henri paused. I wouldn't have stood in her way if she was supposed to have something and there was another will. Are you certain? The man now appeared worn out. In soul, not in body. I own a store. A peaceful existence. I didn't request Marcel's cash. I didn't require it. They sat silently for a while. Outside, the cobbled street was starting to get shadowed. A small youngster walked past, putting his nose to the storefront glass and then rushing away. Maigret got up. I would appreciate a call if you can recall anything else at all. Henri gave a nod. Are you going to locate her? I hope so. He made his way back to the station on foot, traversing the city's older neighborhoods where the buildings leaned against one another like ancient conspirators and the streets curled irrationally. He still had the nicely folded carbon copy of her letter in his coat pocket. Back on the train, the dusk had turned the sky outside lavender. In remote settlements, lights continued to blink. Sitting silently, Maigret felt the day sink into his bones. Arlette had once been in love with a man who kept his word. Her name might have been scrawled by a man on a piece of paper that was never located. She had been deleted by omission when he passed away. Perhaps that was the reason she had retreated. Not greed. Not optimism. Only the need to be recognized. To become visible again. She must be in Paris if she was still alive, he thought as he gazed out at the dying landscape. If not, however, someone had made the decision that she would never be seen again. A little before 8 o'clock, the train glided back into Paris. As porters shouted out and couples reconnected on the platform without ceremony, a low haze clung to the station's vaulted ceiling, and steam rose in lazy swirls. Despite the fact that his suitcase was empty save for his notepad and a few papers folded neatly out of long habit, Maigret stepped out of the carriage with his coat buttoned to the throat. Without him, the city had reverted to its former nature. Rain-soaked streets, steam and breath-fogged café windows, and buses moaning at corners. Known. Unbreakable. He lighted his pipe as he stepped out into the evening and proceeded to the taxi queue, providing the address without hesitation. Rue du Repos, close to Père Lachaise. With a gentle mechanical snap, the driver turned the meter after nodding. In this instance, he had never been to the address before. However, he had been thinking about it since the beginning. Not exactly a clue. Rather a shadow. A feeling that the narrative had always been moving toward a darker place, despite all of its silent passages and unwritten letters. Finally, somewhere. Maigret thought of Arlette once more as they drove. Not the woman who was seen from afar, but the impression she made on other people's memories. An empty room filled with the aroma of gardenias. Behind a cabinet, someone posed a query. A look from the other side of the street. She had only been there when she was absent. And now the quiet around her was starting to seem purposeful. The taxi arrived outside the apartment complex at 36 Rue du Repos, which is situated next to the stone side of the cemetery wall. There were rusty balconies, small live-scraped shutters, and a kid's tricycle left on the landing. After paying the fare, Maigret went outside and peered up at the structure. There was no light coming from the third-floor windows. He rang the bell at apartment 3B after gently making his way up the stairs, the worn carpet softening his footsteps. No response. He waited. Knocked after that. A rhythmic, gentle tap. Nothing. A latch clicked from the next door, and a woman in her 60s looked out. Wearing a dressing gown, she carried a cookie in one hand and a saucer in the other. "She isn't present," the woman stated bluntly. "Arlette?" The woman's eyes narrowed. "She changed her name to Claire." "Yes, it was her, though. Relocated 2 months ago. Keep quiet. Courteous. Paid with cash." "Where is she?" The neighbor gave a shrug. "Gone." "Gone?" "She departed 2 evenings ago. About 11 o'clock. The door was heard. Then nothing." "Did she have guests?" "Once or twice. Men. Various ones. But silent. Nothing boisterous." "Did you see her on her departure day?" The female paused. "Indeed. Early in the day. She appeared worn out. And depressing. However, she grinned. She mentioned she might be leaving soon and asked if I wanted the rest of her tea." Maigret nodded slightly. "Did she mention her destination?" "No." "Did you hear anything out of the ordinary that evening?" "No," she repeated. However, there was a pause in her speech. "Are you certain?" The woman's gaze shifted to her slippered feet. A sound was heard. Upon her departure. 20 minutes later, perhaps. Like a return visit. I didn't get up, though. And ever since? No sound. Not a light. She has not returned." After thanking her, Maigret waited for her door to click shut once more. Then he knocked at 3B again. He tested the handle after a brief pause. Locked. He exited the building, went around to the back entrance, and discovered the caretaker's lodge dimly illuminated and reeking of damp rags and old smoke. A man sat at a table and ate cold sausage from a jar with bread and mustard. Without much interest, he gazed up. "You possess a key to 3B?" Maigret inquired. The man gave his neck a scratch. "She hasn't made any payments this month. I'm with law enforcement." After wiping his hands, the man cautiously rose up and took the key from a wall hook. Maigret came in by herself. It was dark in the flat. He slightly opened the shutters, allowing the street lamp's little light to enter. The room was tiny and only had a bed, table, and chair. A broken mirror. No pictures. A candle half burned. On the table next to a cup with lipstick on the rim was a tiny bottle of scent gardenia. There's no violence. However, there was a problem. He moved at a leisurely pace, paying attention with both his eyes and his intuition. It didn't feel like a left room. It seemed to pause. She had taken her coat off the hook. However, there was still a pair of shoes under the bed. There was one drawer that was empty. The others were still carrying a comb, some underwear, and folded blouses. He looked in the restroom. A toothbrush. Dish of soap. A lipstick case without a cap. A ripped piece of paper with half a name was found in the trash can. Uden. Renaudin. Sitting on the bed's edge, Maigret gazed at the sheet of paper. The other half was absent. His pipe was not lit. Simply sat there for a few minutes, taking in the silence of the place. Hearing what was left unsaid. She was back. She had discovered something. Or someone. Then she had disappeared. He went back to the street and strolled toward the quay instead of the office, following the Seine's bend as though it might provide him with answers. As the city drew closer, the air grew cooler. Heads dropped, a few people rushed by. Gleaming gold against the damp, lights flickered in café windows. He stopped for a calvados at a little brasserie close to the Bastille. The bartender remained silent. It was a heavy, clean glass. He sipped gently, thinking about people rather than hints. Renaudin, shaky and pallid. Precise and still scarred by recollection, Madame Vernou. Too sensible, Henri Delroux. Too indifferent. Arlette, too. Or Claire. The person she had attempted to be. A woman who had led a tranquil life abruptly departed and returned without notice. She hadn't been evading the law. Indifference had been her hiding place. He paid, finished his drink, and went out into the night once more. He didn't return home. Not quite yet. He turned toward the Rue Popincourt flat. He hadn't heard all from Renaudin. Now Maigret was certain. And maybe, with the correct illumination and quiet, the man would at last start talking. Maigret arrived to Rue Popincourt after 10 o'clock. The building appeared the same as it had when he had been earlier. It was dark, narrow, and slightly leaned toward the street as though it had grown weary of standing. There was a dim glimmer in the stairwell. A tinny, far-off waltz was played on a radio somewhere above. Slowly, he ascended the stairs. No rush. He would knock till Renaudin woke up if he was asleep. Maigret had a suspicion that the man had been anticipating him if he wasn't. He knocked at the right-hand side of the third floor. No footsteps. However, the door opened in a matter of seconds. Wearing a wool sweater over a collared shirt, Renaudin stood in the doorway. No tie. His face appeared narrower than it had previously. More devoid of substance. However, the cloud that had surrounded his eyes during their previous encounter had vanished. "I knew you would return," he said. Maigret remained silent. He entered. Nothing had changed in the room. Above the sink, one light bulb was burning. It was frigid on the little stove. On the table next to a newspaper folded back to the classified advertisements was an unopened cup of tea. Gently, Renaudin shut the door behind him and stood with his hands in his sleeves. Maigret walked over to the window but left it open. "Didn't you see her again?" Renaudin didn't say anything, but his eyes darted. Maigret slowly turned. "She wasn't just someone you saw on the street by your workplace. Later, you saw her. In a more private setting." Renaudin took a swallow. "She arrived here." Maigret gave a single nod. "When?" 3 evenings prior. The evening she departed from Rue du Repos. "Yes." "Had she discovered you?" "I believe she had followed me. Or perhaps she awaited my pursuit." "She entered this room?" Renaudin gave a nod. "She rapped on the door." "She just stood there, watching me, when I opened the door." "What did she say?" He sat slowly, as though his limbs needed to be negotiated in order to perform the task. "She inquired as to whether I recalled her." "Yes, I did." "I did, of course. Despite my desire to forget her, I was unable to do so." "How well did you know her in those days?" "I didn't really know her. The floor where we worked was the same. Every morning, she walked past my desk, always in a rush and with a perfumed scent. She treated me with kindness. Not nasty, not flirty. Just be nice." "Good morning," she said. Maigret waited. The circle of silence encircled them. Renaudin raised his head. "You must comprehend. Individuals like her never talk to people like myself. I wasn't attractive. I wasn't brave. I was merely present. Invisible. However, she noticed you." "Yes." "And when she visited you the other night?" "That was sufficient to stick with me." She appeared older. Sadder. She was still herself, though. "Did you have tea?" she said with a smile. At first, we avoided discussing the past. Merely sat. She claimed to have gone days without sleep. "Did she explain her reason for visiting you?" He paused. "She claimed to be looking for something. Or someone. She did not identify the person. However, I was aware. She had been talking about Delrue. You heard about him from her?" She claimed to have loved him. Or believed she had. That something had been promised by him. Perhaps she had even thought he would leave her something upon his passing. Maigret was seated across from him. And you? What were you saying? I remained silent. I simply listened. Maigret spoke in a low tone. You mentioned that your first impression of her made you feel bad. Renaudin gave a slow nod. I was aware that she had vanished. After she went, I heard the rumors. That she had been exploited by someone. That she had asked inappropriate questions. Regarding money. Regarding wills. Then she vanished one day. I often pondered whether I had raised my voice or informed someone she had been concerned. You kept it to yourself, I said. I was terrified. Of what? Renaudin's voice trailed off. That people would make fun of me. I would be told to keep my mouth shut. Because nobody thought a man like me had anything important to say. Maigret inclined herself forward. What transpired following her visit to you? Renaudin cast a downward glance. She spent the night there. In your bed? No, on the sofa. I just wanted a place where I could be safe for a short time, she said. I poured her tea and handed her a blanket. She inquired as to whether I thought she had ever truly mattered to anyone. I was unsure of how to respond. Additionally, in the morning? She had left. You failed to stop her? I was dozing off. The door was open when I awoke. Maigret looked at him. Do you believe she intended to vanish once more? I'm not sure. Didn't you follow her? I had no idea where she had disappeared to. Maigret was silent for a while. He got up, went to the sink, and washed his hands as though to wipe away the dust from the discourse. Then he went the other way. A ripped piece of paper was left in her trash can. It has your name on it. Renaudin's eyes were closed. She only returned to you, Maigret remarked quietly. Not the relative. Not the attorney. Not the business. You. Why? Renaudin murmured. Because you showed kindness since you were reminded of her. Since you paid attention. Renaudin's eyes opened. Are you going to locate her? I'm still unsure if she wants to be located. Once more, they sat in silence. Through the muffled car horns, the clatter of dishes, and the distant barking of a dog, the faint hum of the city could be heard. Maigret surveyed the cramped space, its emptiness, its isolation. Not a place to live, but a place to exist. Finally, Maigret added, she trusted you. And such faith is uncommon. Renaudin nodded slightly, as if he were bowing his head. Would you notify me if she writes, phones, or just stops by again when she returns? Maigret went on. Yes, I will. Maigret stood up. Good night, Mr. Renaudin. He walked carefully down the stairway as he silently exited the building. The night had grown cooler outside. The air was still damp and sticky, but the rain had ceased again. The orange flare of the match short contrasted with the gloom as he lit his pipe and turned up the collar of his coat. She was still out there. Somewhere. At least now she had someone waiting for her. The following morning dawned overcast and without breeze. Paris's typical rhythm was subdued as it sat under a cover of low, motionless cloud. On that day, the city asked for nothing and received nothing in return. Maigret arrived earlier than usual to Quai d'Orfèvres. Early in the morning, the stairwell's draft was more acute than anticipated for spring, and the hallways were quieter. With a weary but unconcerned expression, Lucas was already at his desk, going through a tiny pile of overnight dispatches. As Maigret walked in, he glanced up and nodded slightly without saying anything. There was no new tragedy or imminent death among the stack of papers between them. No trace of her? Maigret removed his coat and asked. Lucas gave a headshake. Not just yet. Has she not gone back to Rue du Repos? No. I gave the landlady a call. Nothing has changed. Nobody has spotted her. Maigret filled his pipe and grunted softly. The tobacco was hesitant to light and appeared slightly moist. Before the flame caught, he struck the match twice. What about Renaudin? He didn't say anything either. I've instructed the switchboard to fix any issues right now. With her pipe in hand, Maigret stood for a bit before making her way to the window. This morning, the Seine appeared to be slate. Not tumultuous, not still, just passing by with no remarks. He saw a boat go by beneath the Pont Marie and vanish. Do you believe she has departed the city? After some while, Lucas inquired. I believe she never really went back to it, Maigret remarked softly. Lucas initially remained silent. Then, softly, you think she came just to bid you farewell? Maigret remained silent. He put down the pipe and went back to his chair, where he sat heavily. She might have realized that she had nothing left in this place. No inheritance. No fairness. Not even the recollection of a name. Lucas gave him a close look. So why come? Maigret gave a shrug. Humans are inconsistent. We construct our lives on a foundation of modest humiliations and half-hopes. Perhaps she returned to check on any changes. And it hadn't. Not in the manner she required. There was a full, but not uncomfortable, stillness between them. The telephone then rang. Lucas grabbed it. Listened. Gave it to Maigret after that. At Gare de Lyon, a man. Luggage for work. Claims that he may have seen her. Maigret accepted the phone. Maigret. The voice on the other end sounded scratchy and unsure, like someone accustomed to talking over background noise. She arrived last night. I'm quite certain. About 10:30. She appeared to be unsure of her destination. Purchased a ticket and discarded it. Perched on one of the benches by the closed newspaper stand in the far corner. Over an hour was spent sitting there. Didn't communicate with anyone. So what? Get to Marseilles by train. The one at midnight. As the bell rang, I watched her climb on. Carriage? 3. Middle section. Was she by herself? Yes. Maigret hesitated. Why are you phoning right now? She left a scarf behind. Gardenia. When she boarded, it was on the bench. Until I saw the bulletin this morning, I had no idea what to do with it. Thank you for the call. After hanging up, he got up and grabbed his coat once again. Gare de Lyon? Lucas inquired. Maigret gave a nod. Do you want me to attend? No. I'll go by myself. The taxi ride went smoothly. The driver made no effort to engage in conversation, instead humming to himself. Children were making their way to school, delivery vehicles were nudges along the curbs, and pigeons were chasing crumbs outside cafes as the morning carried on. Maigret ignored the clatter of commuters and the reverberation of announcements as she passed the main departure boards at the station. Still lightly covered with soot from passing trains, he located the bench close to the closed kiosk. As promised, the scarf was present. Cheap fabric, the kind sold by stalls near the Bastille, faintly frayed. Nevertheless, in some way, it preserved the wearer's memory. He initially sat on the bench next to it without touching it. Merely taking in the dense, coal-thickened air and seeing the arrivals and departures. She was present. Sat here. Examined the schedules and the arches. Perhaps she reflected on what the city had given and stolen from her. A train thundered across the distant platform. At last he took the scarf. Once and then again, I folded it. Like a document, he slipped it inside his coat pocket. He sat by the window of the station cafe and ordered a coffee. His palms warmed as the steam rose softly from the cup. The newspaper was not read by him. Didn't take notes. Just a thought. He pictured her sitting alone herself in a compartment on the train to Marseilles, watching the suburb lights disappear behind her. No bags. No goodbye. Just the act of departing. By daybreak, she would be there. Look for a room close to the harbor, maybe. Watch the boats leave, maybe. Or maybe keep walking, getting back on her feet before anything gets to her. Maigret took a cautious sip of his coffee. He considered everyone who had momentarily, dimly, touched her life. Madame Vernou, with her keen sense of missing persons. Henri Delrue, happy with his gift. The neighbor in the dressing gown, the stationers, and the solicitor. No one had really known her. Renaudin, however, had seen her. Had recalled. And he had offered her tea when she returned, not for retribution, money, or justice, but just to be welcomed. Quiet. Shelter. Maigret refused to provide a report. There was silence, no crime. No bad guy, only carelessness. They hadn't abducted Arlette. She was gone. Just like she used to. This time, it was different because someone had taken note. Without haste, he paid, finished his coffee, and returned to the concourse. He chose not to hail a cab. He took a step. The streets back toward the quay were lined with trees that were just beginning to bloom. The first scents of spring-wet stone, exhaust, and blooms clinging to twigs were in the air. Paris, timeless and uncaring, throbbed softly about him. With his pipe out of his pocket, Maigret strolled with the silent assurance that something had happened. Not a crime. However, a life. Momentarily apparent. Recalled for a moment.